Picture a medieval wedding. What comes to mind? Probably a grand castle, a princess in a flowing gown, a handsome prince, and a declaration of undying love. It's the stuff of fairy tales, the foundation of countless fantasy stories we've all grown up with. Now, take that beautiful, romantic image and throw it in the nearest dungeon. The reality of marriage in the Middle Ages was less about romance and more about brutal, cold, hard strategy. It was a world where love was a luxury few could afford, and a wedding was one of the most high-stakes, terrifying, and public events a person could endure. What if I told you the bride and groom were often children who had never met? That the wedding night was a spectator sport? That getting married was closer to a corporate merger than a romantic union? In this video, we're pulling back the velvet curtain to reveal the shocking, strategic, and often stomach-churning truth about getting hitched in the Middle Ages. First things first, we need to completely erase the modern concept of marrying for love. For the nobility and landed gentry of the Middle Ages, marriage was the single most important tool for consolidating power, acquiring land, and forging political alliances. Think of it less as a union of two hearts and more as a merger of two kingdoms, or two powerful families. The individuals getting married, especially the bride and groom, were often the last people to be consulted. Their personal feelings were entirely irrelevant. A daughter from one noble house might be married to the son of a rival to end a generation-long feud. A son might be married to an heiress with vast lands to double his family's influence. These arrangements were meticulously negotiated by the families, with lawyers and clerics hashing out the details for months, sometimes years. The couple themselves were simply pawns on a much larger chessboard, their lives dictated by the ambitions of their parents. If the marriage was a business deal, then the bride was, in no uncertain terms, the primary asset being traded. From the moment she was born, a noble daughter's value was calculated based on her lineage, the land she might inherit, and the political connections her marriage could secure. She had virtually no agency in the choice of her husband. She could be promised to someone when she was still a toddler, a practice that cemented alliances long before the children could even understand what was happening. Her education was tailored to make her a more valuable bride. She learned to manage a household, to be obedient, and to produce heirs. Her virginity was paramount, not for moral reasons, but because it guaranteed that any child she produced was her husband's legitimate heir, ensuring the all-important bloodline remained pure. Any suggestion of impurity could shatter the entire marriage contract and bring shame and financial ruin upon her family. Today, an engagement can be broken. In the Middle Ages, the betrothal was a far more serious and legally binding affair. There were two types of promises recognized by the Church. The first was sponsalia de futuro, a promise to marry in the future. This was typically what happened with child betrothals. However, the second was sponsalia de presenti, a promise made in the present tense. For example, I take you as my wife. If two people of legal age said these words to each other, even without a priest or witnesses, the Church considered them legally married. This created a minefield of legal and social problems. A powerful lord could coerce a wealthy heiress into saying the words, effectively claiming her and her fortune on the spot. It also meant that a childhood betrothal, made years ago, could suddenly be enforced, forcing two strangers into a lifelong union they had no memory of agreeing to. The power of these spoken words was absolute and terrifying. Since marriage was a transaction, it naturally involved a massive exchange of wealth. This came in two primary forms, the dowry and the dower. The dowry was the wealth, money, land, livestock, knights that the bride's family paid to the groom's family. It was essentially a payment for taking on the financial burden of the wife and a way to sweeten the deal for a powerful alliance. A large dowry could allow a lower-ranking family to marry up into a more powerful one. The dower, on the other hand, was the groom's gift to the bride. It was a portion of his property, typically about 1/3, that was designated for her use and financial security should he die before her. This was her only real source of personal wealth and security. The negotiation of the dowry and dower was one of the most contentious parts of the marriage arrangement. If the dowry wasn't paid on time, the marriage could be delayed or called off. If the dower was considered too small, the bride's family might reject the offer. It was pure, unadulterated financial negotiation. The actual wedding ceremony was not the private, intimate affair we imagine. For most of the Middle Ages, the sacrament of marriage was performed publicly, at the church door, for the whole community to witness. Why? Because this wasn't just about two people, it was a public transfer of property and status. The community acted as the official witnesses. Inside the church, a mass would be held to bless the union, but the legally binding part happened outside. The priest would ask in the vernacular tongue if anyone knew of any reason the two could not be married, such as being too closely related, a common issue among the aristocracy, or a prior marriage contract. The bride was formally given by her father to the groom, symbolizing the transfer of authority from one man to another. If you think the public nature of the wedding ended at the church door, you're in for a shock. The marriage was not considered fully valid and unbreakable until it had been consummated. And in an era where the legitimacy of heirs was everything, they needed proof. This led to the deeply uncomfortable and bizarre ritual known as the bedding ceremony. After the wedding feast, which was often a multi-day affair of excessive eating and drinking, the wedding party would escort the bride and groom to their bedchamber. Guests would help the couple undress, often making lewd and raucous jokes. A priest would enter to bless the marriage bed, sprinkling it with holy water to promote fertility. Then, the couple would be put into bed together, the curtains would be drawn, and the guests would finally leave them to it. In some extreme cases, particularly for high-level royalty, high-ranking witnesses would remain in the room, or just outside the door, waiting for proof that the deed was done. The next morning, the bed sheets might even be displayed as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. It was the ultimate invasion of privacy, all in the name of politics and succession. Life after the wedding offered little relief, especially for the wife. She moved to her husband's home, often a foreign land where she knew no one and didn't speak the language. Her primary, and often sole, duty was to produce an heir, preferably a male one. If she failed to conceive, or only produced daughters, she could be viewed as a failure, and her husband might seek to have the marriage annulled. Domestic abuse was common and, in many cases, legally permissible. A man was considered the master of his household and had the right to chastise his wife physically. While the church condemned excessive cruelty, the line was blurry and rarely enforced. The wife had no legal standing of her own, she was under the complete legal authority of her husband, a status known as coverture. She couldn't own property in her own name, enter into contracts, or sue in court. What if you were trapped in one of these miserable, strategic marriages? Could you get a divorce? The simple answer is no. The Catholic Church viewed marriage as a holy sacrament, indissoluble until death. The only way out was an annulment, which was not a divorce, but a declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place. To get one, you had to prove one of a few specific things. You were too closely related. The church had incredibly complex rules about this, and since nobles frequently intermarried, it was the most common loophole for kings and queens wanting to get out of a politically inconvenient marriage. One of the parties had already made a promise of marriage, sponsalia de presenti, to someone else. The marriage was never physically completed. This was, of course, very difficult and humiliating to prove. For the average person, getting an annulment was virtually impossible. It was a long, expensive legal process that was really only available to the very wealthy and powerful. While the nobility were playing their high-stakes marriage games, what about the peasants and commoners who made up over 90% of the population? Their experience was different, but not necessarily better. Since they had no land, titles, or political power to negotiate, they had far more freedom to choose their partners based on affection or practicality. A strong man to work the fields and a hard-working woman to manage the home was a partnership based on survival. They often engaged in more informal unions, sometimes called handfasting, where a couple would live together as married before having an official church ceremony. However, their lives were defined by grueling labor and poverty. While they may have had more personal choice, their union was a pact to face a life of immense hardship together, where the death of a partner could mean utter destitution for the one left behind. So, from a business merger sealed in childhood, to a public spectacle that ended with witnesses outside the bedroom door, the medieval wedding was a world away from our modern ideals. It was a tool of power, a financial contract, and a public duty that placed immense pressure on the individuals involved, particularly women. The fairy tales give us the glamour, but history reveals the grit, the strategy, and the often brutal reality. What part of this surprised you the most? Was it the legally binding child betrothals or the public wedding ceremony? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you found this journey back in time as fascinating as I did, please give this video a huge thumbs up, it really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the shocking side of history. Feel free to share this with any history buffs you know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.